So today we are going to be talking about perfusion. We're going to define perfusion, explain its pathophysiology, meaning what happens when perfusion is not functioning properly, and we are also going to be talking about circulation, blood vessels, and why oxygen is so important to us in the first place. Why is oxygen necessary for our survival? So let's get right. In order to define perfusion, we first have to understand the anatomy and physiology of two body systems, namely the pulmonary system and circulatory system. These two systems together are called the cardiopulmonary system. Cardio means heart, pulmonary. As hopefully we know, we can receive oxygen through our nose or our mouth. The air coming through our nose happens to be cleaner because there are more filters, but either way, the air ends up in the same part called the pharynx. Then it travels down the larynx, past the epiglottis, down the trachea, also known as your windpipe, down the two bronchi, the right and left bronchi, to the bronchioles, and finally, at the very end of the bronchioles are these clusters of air sacs called alveoli. And here's a picture of the alveoli. As you can see, they are like grapes, and they function like a balloon. When you inhale, they inflate. When you exhale, they deflate. So this is where the oxygen ends up. Like we said, it goes from your mouth, down the trachea, down the bronchi, bronchioles, and it ends up in the alveoli. The alveoli are extremely important because this is where the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange occur. But before we get into that, let's first talk about the circulatory system. The circulatory system, as explained in a previous video, is made up of arteries, veins, blood, and the heart. Let's talk about anatomy of the heart. There are four chambers: the right atria, right ventricle, left atria, and left ventricle. Now that we know the anatomy, we can talk about circulation, the blood flow. Blood comes into the right atria through these two big veins, the superior vena cava and inferior vena cava. This is not exactly so accurate because these aren't attached like this. The superior vena cava comes from the upper extremities, whereas the inferior vena cava comes from the lower extremities, like your legs. Either way, the blood ends up in the right atria. From there, it goes to the right ventricle, to the pulmonary artery. Before we talk about the pulmonary artery, let's first define an artery. An artery is a blood vessel that carries blood away from the heart. Artery away, AA. A vein is a blood vessel that carries blood to the heart. Generally speaking, a vein is deoxygenated, which is noted as being blue, and an artery is oxygenated, which is noted as red. However, this rule is not exactly foolproof. That's why we define artery as a blood vessel carrying blood away from the heart and a vein carrying blood to the heart. Let's see why this is the case. So as we said, the blood comes from the right atria to the right ventricle. From there, it goes to the pulmonary artery. So as you can see, this pulmonary artery is blue. It's not oxygenated. So this is an exception to the rule. However, it does follow the rule that is taking blood away from the heart. So where does it go? It goes to the right and left lung. The right and left lung. So again, this is not so accurate because this also goes to the left lung. But either way, the blood goes to the lungs. The lungs, as we said, the air ends up in the alveoli, right? This is the lung. This is your bronchioles and ends up in your alveoli. As you can see, the alveoli are covered in capillaries. Capillaries are the thinnest and smallest blood vessels. The walls of the capillary are so thin that it enables the exchange of gases, of oxygen and carbon dioxide, to go from the capillaries to the bloodstream and vice versa. This is extremely important, as we will see right now. So we receive blood. The blood goes to the lungs, and it's there where the blood receives its oxygen. There's something called diffusion. Diffusion is where something from a high concentration goes to a low concentration, whatever it may be. In this case, we'll talk about oxygen. Over here in the blood, the blue side, which means lack of oxygen, there's very little oxygen. But in the alveoli, this area over here, when we inhale, it's full of oxygen. So oxygen is going to go from the alveoli through the capillary wall into the bloodstream, into the capillary. So now this blood becomes red because that signifies oxygenated blood, because oxygen, as we know, carries hemoglobin, which carries the oxygen. So once the oxygen is included into the blood, it becomes red. Blood is never really blue, by the way. Even though our veins may appear blue, it's a darker shade of red when blood is deoxygenated. As we know, veins don't have that much oxygen. That's why they appear blue. Whereas arteries, if you would cut an artery, the blood would be much brighter than if you would cut a vein. That's why if you receive an IV, generally speaking, the blood is a darker shade of red. So anyways, let's get back to what we're talking about. So the air, the oxygen comes from the alveoli, diffuses into the capillaries, and blood becomes oxygenated. From the other spectrum, though, blood is filled with carbon dioxide because carbon dioxide is the waste product of cellular activity. Our cells are constantly active, and the waste product of that from that energy is carbon dioxide. So the blood is filled with carbon dioxide. The alveoli has very little carbon dioxide. So the carbon dioxide is going to diffuse into the alveoli. And when we exhale, that carbon dioxide travels back up the bronchioles, the bronchi, to the trachea, and we finally breathe it out through our mouth. So that's why we exhale carbon dioxide and we take in oxygen. So let's go back to our heart. So here are our lungs. So finally, the blood is now oxygenated. That's why it becomes red. And it now comes back into the heart through the pulmonary vein. Again, this is an exception. Even though veins are generally deoxygenated, this vein is oxygenated. However, it does follow the rule that it's coming towards the heart. So it goes from the right atria, right ventricle to the lungs, back into the left atria, to the left ventricle, and from there it goes into the aorta, which sends the blood to the rest of the body. And that's how we receive blood to our hands and our legs. So now we explained how our blood becomes oxygenated. It's through this exchange of gas through the capillaries and the alveoli. But why is oxygen so important in the first place? As we may know, oxygen and glucose are necessary to cells. As we may know, oxygen and glucose are necessary to the survival of a cell. Glucose is basically sugar. This glucose is converted by the cells into an energy in the form of adenosine triphosphate, also known as ATP. Oxygen is a necessary component of this conversion process. When oxygen is present, glucose is converted in a process called aerobic metabolism. This process produces efficient amounts of energy and minimal waste products, such as carbon dioxide. If oxygen is not present in sufficient supply, this process will shift to anaerobic metabolism. This process produces less energy and more waste products, such as lactic acid. Waste products, in turn, make the body more acidotic, which means that the body has now more acid in it. So oxygen enables for this exchange of glucose into energy. And without that oxygen, we build up more waste product, which can be very dangerous and potentially fatal. That's why oxygen is so important. It's for the energy of the cell. This is why oxygen is so important, because it's necessary for the efficiency of the cell to produce energy and get rid of carbon dioxide, the waste product. So now we can define perfusion. Perfusion is the adequate supply of oxygen to the cells of the body and the proper removal of waste products. So when everything is running smoothly, then we can say that the cells are perfusing properly, that it's receiving enough oxygen and it's getting rid of enough waste product. When the cells are not perfusing properly, we call this hypoperfusion. Hypoperfusion, another name for that is shock. And we can simply just look at the anatomy of our body. There are several ways how we will not be perfusing properly. We can look at the lungs first. If fluid builds up in the alveoli because of a virus or bacteria, this is called pneumonia. And because there's fluid in the alveoli, the exchange of oxygen is not so efficient, and we have less oxygen in our bloodstream, and therefore our cells will be getting less oxygen, which is very dangerous. If we just look at the heart now, let's say the heart is not pumping strongly enough, or for whatever reason we don't have enough blood volume, because let's say we were in a terrible trauma incident and we lost a lot of blood. So without so much blood, we have less oxygen and our body's getting less oxygen. And again, lower perfusion. So these different types of problems of perfusion have different names. We'll be focusing on different types of shock. One type of shock is called hypovolemic shock, which, as I said before, is a low blood volume. So when a person loses a lot of blood, the cells aren't getting enough oxygen, and we call this hypovolemic shock. Another type of shock is called obstructive shock, which means it's something physically preventing the blood flow, like the clot. So that could lead to shock. Another type of shock is cardiogenic shock, which is when the heart fails in its ability to pump enough blood to the rest of the body. Either way, the common denominator is that there's not enough blood or there's not enough oxygen to get to the cells, and this can be very, very dangerous. So now, just to recap, we defined perfusion, which is the adequate supply of oxygen in cells with the removal of waste products. We explained the pathophysiology, that when we don't receive enough oxygen to cells, this could be potentially fatal, and we call this shock. And there are different types of shock. We also explained why oxygen is so important to the body, because without it, we go into a process called anaerobic metabolism, which is not enough of oxygen level to our cells to produce enough energy, plus we build up waste product. We also explained the circulation of how blood carries throughout the body through veins, arteries, into the heart. And we also explained the oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange between the heart and the lungs, namely on the alveoli. If you have any questions at all, please let me know, and I'll be happy to help. As always, I'll see you next time.